Today we are going to finish off Khami and then try to wrap up and throw some challenges here and there before hopefully arriving at a position that will challenge ourselves. So this is a map of the Zimbabwe Plateau, just showing us where Khami is in relation to Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe, and the other places, just to put everything that we discussed into perspective, and also to emphasize that in the absence of modern political boundaries, perhaps the landscape would have been more like this, and people would have been free to move around. So going to Khami, just perhaps a minor recap. Khami is a World Heritage Site. Traditionally, it used to be believed that Khami was established by people that upon the collapse of Great Zimbabwe in AD 1450. But the big question is that so? And what I'm going to be doing is to show you some of the archaeological evidence from Khami, as well as the dating evidence, to also ask the questions, if Great Zimbabwe and Khami chronologically overlap, does it make sense for Khami to have come out of Great Zimbabwe, and so on? What are the similarities between the two, and what are the differences? So for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been leading excavations at the at Khami, and this is one of our trenches. I don't know how clear is it at the back, but archaeologists tend to think in terms of layers. So each layer you see is a different event, is a different activity. We get samples of charcoal and other datable material. We come up with a sequence of occupation. Everything in here will be mixed: pottery, glass beads, fragments of metal, remains of plants, and so on. So I'm just going to show you some of the material that comes out of these excavations, and as well as give my thoughts in terms of what they might mean in terms of the archaeology of Khami. At this point, let me also mention that the cognitive structuralist interpretation, which was imprinted onto Great Zimbabwe by Tom Huffman. So the same thinking that you have a palace, you have an area for royal wives, you have a court, and so on. Huffman has also done the same thing for Khami. So the hill complex that we saw yesterday, that is where the king was living, and then there's also some space that he believes the royal wives were occupying. Today, I'm not going much into that kind of thinking, but just so that you remember that, well, the same theoretical framework has been applied here as well. So this is just to show you some of the things that we find. So this is one of the shoulder blades from a cow or an ox. Khami is one of, I've excavated at Great Zimbabwe, but I think I haven't excavated an archaeological site that has as much cattle bone as Khami, which tends to perhaps support the views that we get from the Portuguese documents that this area was a great cattle keeping country. And away from cattle and herd management, Khami was also one of those important centers for metalworking. Can we have a quiz? What is this? Flute. Wow, I love music. Any other guesses? What is this? What is this? Oh, I had never imagined that it could be a flute. This is a wire draw plate. So when you are working, when they were working metal, so let's see a metal that is as ductile and malleable as copper, you just put it through these different holes and then pull it. And then you end up with the thinnest diameter of wire. So all these are the different stages in the process of wire drawing. So metallurgy, one of the major crafts that were practiced at Khami. Hall and Neal, 1902 rather, they found at least 4.2 kilograms of gold from the hill complex at Khami. So what they simply did was to sweep the house floors, and in the process they recovered that much gold. Most of it was sold to Cecil John Rhodes. So wire drawing, one of the most interesting techniques, and some of the wires were very thin, that it is difficult to tell whether they were industrially produced or how did they get to those very thin diameters. And in terms of the objects for other functions, these are different arrowheads from Khami. Of course, hunting was a major component of the economy, and there's a lot of game in the area. So if we are to adopt a uniformitarian argument and assume that the conditions in operation today are the same as those in operation in the past, then perhaps some of the animals would have been, elephant, eland, and the like. I must also emphasize that there are some lion bones that were recovered from the hill complex at Khami. The thinking is that perhaps they were used in medicines as charms and so on. Nobody really knows, but there is evidence that a lion bone was recovered from the hill complex at Khami. That could have been a byproduct of hunting. These iron holes are not necessarily from Khami, but they are for illustrative purposes. So in terms of agriculture, these are some of the tools that would have been used to excavate, and these are the iron smelting furnaces that were used to produce the iron. This design is from Nyanga in eastern Zimbabwe. It's informed by a paper by F.O. Bernhard, which was published, I think, in 1962, if not 1961. So this is an iconography of a woman giving birth, according to F.O. Bernhard, because this process was metaphorically associated with human reproduction. And some of the features that you find on this furnace suggest that the furnace was metaphorically a woman. So that's just some information associated with this technology. Some more tools associated with metalworking. These I'm not so sure what they were used for, but this is a small bronze ring, again from Khami. Where did the tin, which was mixed with copper to produce bronze at Khami, come from? So far there is a Khamativ to the north of Khami, but there is no evidence for indigenous tin working, and the suggestion is that the tin would have been sourced from Rooiberg, just near Tabazimbi, and then there were networks of distribution going to that area. Somebody asked about burials and what the nature of burials would have been. There are one or two burials which were recovered from Khami, but they date to the Leopardoscopy period. But a Khami period layer at Danangombe, which is known as Lolo in some writing, yielded the skeleton of a woman who is believed to have been of a high status and who was in one of the houses inside one of the enclosures. And this is one of the leg long bones, and is associated with this amount of copper. which is, when I first saw it, I said, well, was this person able to walk with this amount of metal? Or is it that somebody was buried elsewhere, and then after decomposition and stuff like that, the bone was the metal was then added to the bone, and the skeleton was reburied? Which one would make sense? I don't know. It's just a possibility. But this seemed to be very, very, very heavy metal to assume that one would also have a similar amount of ornamentation on another leg and also on the arms. Well, they are super women, I believe. Glass beads. They were also recovered from Khami. This time we also see these ones navy blue or cerulean blue. We also see these apple greens. They were also recovered from Great Zimbabwe, these types of beads. So that is another layer of information that suggests to us that Great Zimbabwe and Khami chronologically overlap. Who controlled the distribution of these glass beads? Was it Great Zimbabwe? Was it Khami? What were the dynamics of trade and exchange? Were middlemen, middlewomen involved? What was the nature of that trade? We don't have much information, but one would assume that it was a combination of both. But one of the most important things to note about this area, if we are to go into economic anthropology, is that before the Portuguese, it doesn't appear as if there were markets as in a fixed place where people can come and trade. We don't seem to find that evidence. Markets during this time, they tend to be perhaps transient, where people were moving and trading in villages and elsewhere. But with the appearance of the Portuguese, they established those trading centers, particularly in the north, at places such as Masapa, Dambarare, Luanza, Bokuto, and so on. And there you also find European-style buildings that are associated with those permanent trading settlements. So that is a very big difference between the trade that is taking place this time and that associated with the Portuguese. So was it a market-based system? Was it a command type of economy? We don't know. But perhaps if we are to seek refuge in safety, then maybe we might say perhaps it was a combination of both. Ceramics or pots, they were also recovered from Khami, and Khami also tends to have these elaborately decorated pots, and which appear with different designs and colors. This is what is known as the bend and panel pottery from Khami. Those of us who have been to the George Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford, there is some of the best pots from Khami are on display there, and it's quite amazing. But in terms of the designs, well, do designs on pots mean much? That is a question that I will ask later. So this is a photograph of some of the pots. This is how they look like. So this is red ochre, iron oxide, perhaps hematite, and then this is graphite. So these alternating layers and designs. The pots do look great. So that's another shot, and more of the same. And these pots are quite distinct from Great Zimbabwe. You don't find these lavishly, elaborately decorated pots from Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe pots, they are rather very plain, and as somebody said, to the point of being monotonous, because they are just the same. Does this imply a difference in ethnicity? Possibly. I don't know how good this resolution is from the back, but imported ceramics were also recovered from Khami, and these imported ceramics include Chinese porcelain, some ceramics, 17th century ceramics from Germany, as well as from perhaps Portugal, and some Arabic ceramics. This is perhaps a better photograph, but this top section, that is only ceramics from Khami. So yes, Khami was participating in a long distance trade. What we don't know is the directionality of that trade. Were the people using the Zambezi River as the channel? Because from East Delta at the Indian Ocean up to, people could have followed it into the interior and then down to Khami. All we can do is to speculate. Just a small comment perhaps on this piece. This is a piece of what is known as Islamic fruitware. So that is recovered from Great Zimbabwe, just to show that there are some Islamic ceramics from that site, and there's also some from Danangombe or Lolo, which is the archaeological site that came after Khami. There is also an interesting and important debate in archaeology at the moment, particularly when people talk of what are known as globally shared commodities. What is the significance of these pieces of porcelain? Were they complete, or were they used as fragments? So if we are to think in terms of the biography of objects, what significance would they have? And in conventional interpretations, they are associated with prestige. So if you see imported materials, then the assumption is that they are associated with the elite. And as I said, Khami is believed to be a capital, and we can generalize here the same about Great Zimbabwe, the same about Mapungubwe. Do these fragments of pots represent prestige? And if so, whose prestige? So the key question then is that, if you have possession of these objects, how do you convert them into political power or into economic power? That's another question that we also don't have an answer to. My personal view is that they could have been gifts from traders through, rites of passage. You come into an area, you want to smooth people, to make sure that you make it easy for you to gain their attention, get good favors. Then you give them these things as presents. The reason why I'm saying so is, of course, I'm influenced by Marcel Maus's book, The Gift. But what is influencing my thinking is that there are not many. These fragments, the highest amount of these ceramics, there is known from Great Zimbabwe, and it's not more than 100 even. So Khami, we are talking about less than 15. That's why I'm saying, did they have the significance which they had? In contrast to this, I mentioned that the Portuguese established their trading centers in the north, and they also had their houses there in the north. So, as an example, the archaeological site of Dambarare, which is a Portuguese trading station, it has yielded more than 5,000 fragments of these. Masapa also had more than 1,000. So there is actually more material, and the thinking could be that perhaps the Portuguese were using those for themselves. If you want to argue in the extreme, then you might say maybe those Portuguese suffered economic ruin because the locals refused to buy them. Whichever way, I think we need to rethink the way we consider these objects. I mentioned that there are iron gongs that were recovered from Great Zimbabwe. This is an example from Khami, but it's the same as the ones from Great Zimbabwe. This is a single one. Sometimes you get another one, another complementary one here, which then makes them the double gongs. And then the most interesting thing about information is that here we are told that this is West Africa. So this is a photograph from a display at Khami. So West Africa, why? Because the modern distribution is mostly in the Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Nigeria, and that area. But the Tabwa people and other groups in the modern day DRC, they also, and some communities in the Copper Belt area of Zambia, they also make these iron gongs. They play some nice musical tunes, and again suggesting some forms of contact between widely separated regions, direct and perhaps indirect. Then there are also these bracelets made of copper, and again they would have been used for ornamentation. If you are interested in metallurgy and process, I'm not so sure from the back, but you can actually see some marks in terms of hammering and so on, such that those with a good eye can actually figure the direction in which the person who made this was hammering them. It's very easy to detect that information. Glass beads, I also mentioned that this is an apron which is on display at the Natural History Museum in Bulawayo. So the other time I mentioned the fact that these glass beads were not used as units, as individuals, but as composites. So this is an example. And that's why I was challenging you that day to say, how many glass beads would be these? And if we find only 1 or 10 from our excavation, what does it mean? Those are some of the questions that are forcing us to rethink some of the interpretations. And here, the person that wrote this display, they're saying that you could find them on skates, ornaments, as well as on charms. So these are items of material culture that were widely used. Are they associated with prestige? Are they associated with status? Or if we are to think like anthropologists, what gives a status? Is it objects, or is the office of a person? Am I important because I am the Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, or I am important because of the office that I have? How do we separate the two? Archaeologically, of course, that's very difficult to tell, but of course, sometimes we know that an office does give significance to people, and also to their possessions. So when I was still a student at the University College London a while back, I had an opportunity to go and have tea with the Queen. And that's by nothing special, except that the people that funded me, the patron was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. So we benefited from that, because they just said, well, the people that we are funding this year, please, can you come? You know, and so on. So yeah, some of the cups that we saw, they were just important by the mere fact that they were owned by the Queen. Otherwise, if you go to any street, be it Oxford Street or Tottenham Court Road, whatever, it's just a cup outside that. So, but anyway, those are some of the issues that would be difficult to resolve. Ritual was one of the major behaviors associated with Khami, and particularly, you know, these divining dices. So if you may remember one of the slides that I show from Huffman, where he was writing some symbols and saying young men, young woman, and so on. These are the designs that's where he's getting the designs from, and so on. So These ones are ethnographic. They are just these ones are from the ethnography. The same applies to these ones, except these ones are from ivory. These ones are from Khami. They were found from the hill complex, and the interpretation is that they were owned perhaps by the king, or the king had a diviner who was also resident in his quarters. I don't know, but we can just associate them with those belief systems and traditional divining processes. Then there's also this battle axe, which was recovered from Khami, associated with other materials, ivory, hose, and much more, what is known as the horde from Khami. So the design of this is a composite. We have iron and then copper in the middle. This is also associated with Central Africa, and it's believed to have been an insignia for chieftainship, or a symbol of status. These we have looked at and how they were used in fortune telling. What is the chronology of Khami? The Khami is one of those frustratingly and hopelessly poorly dated archaeological sites. There are only 4 radiocarbon dates from a top layer, and the indication is that Khami dates from AD 1400 to 1650. The date 1650 is known from Portuguese records, because there are some records that suggest that some local claimants to the throne allied with the Portuguese, kickstarting a civil war, resulting in the destruction of Khami. And then in 1650, power shifted to Danangombe. However, if we are to think in stratigraphic terms, there is an earlier leopardscopy phase at Khami, the other day what I described as Mambo, and then not at Khami itself, but with somewhere closer to Bulawayo town, there is a farm known as Woolandale. So phase 2 is also known from the same area. But if we look at glass beads and the other materials, Khami chronologically overlaps with Great Zimbabwe, particularly for the period 1400 to perhaps 1500 and so on. So this sort of questions the thinking that Khami emerged out of Great Zimbabwe. And a question that we will ask is, if Khami did not come out of Great Zimbabwe, then what is its origin? And the suggestion then could be that perhaps Khami is a continuation of the local leopardscopy. So what is very difficult to understand, particularly as far as the relationship between Khami and Danangombe, is that Danangombe has an earlier occupation. So there are maybe three or four archaeological sites where soapstone, such as those beds that are known from Great Zimbabwe, are known from. Danangombe is one of them, and it also has some earlier material when compared to Khami. But archaeologists and historians as well just start from 1650. So that earlier occupation, nobody talks about it. But could it be possible that actually power may have started at Danangombe, shifted to Khami, and then back to Danangombe? Particularly, we know that in terms of power dynamics, sometimes power shifts from regions based on lineages, families, and so on. Those are some of the possibilities that would make sense, but nevertheless would be difficult to prove archaeologically. As I hinted earlier on, Khami collapsed as a result of a civil war that had the Portuguese a hand in it. So in 1650, that is when, remember, the Portuguese also were trying to convert people to Christianity. That is when legend argues that they left that cross which I was talking about the other day. And I forgive me, I completely forgot that I promised to show you that photograph of that cross. But when I grow up, I will honor my promises. Khami has a very enigmatic status in state formation. The platforms, the elaborately decorated ceramics, would suggest a very close relationship to the leopard's copy. And yet, archaeologists don't see a direct relationship between Khami and the leopard's copy. There is Great Zimbabwe in between. And also, what is the relationship between Khami itself and Great Zimbabwe? Are these just competitors that are on the landscape? Are these peers that are on the landscape? Are they friends or are they enemies? Those are some of the issues. And how about Khami and Anangombe, as I suggested? Was there a contestation of power between these two places, where the two lineages associated with power occupying these places? So perhaps in her book, Beyond Chiefdoms, the archaeologist Susan McIntosh argues that studies of state formation in Africa have relied so much on what she calls oceanic models, or models that are imported from elsewhere. So what she encourages people to do is, if we are to dip into a local African political anthropology, can we then get some ideas that we can use to interpret these places? That is the direction that we seem to be going. But the challenge then is that we are dealing with events of different duration. The archaeological record give us evidence as time aggregates. So everything that has existed, you find it in a single layer. Whereas some of the events that happened were of a short duration. Let's say a king has ruled for 5 years. How are you going to tell that? And then power shifted to another place. Radiocarbon dating, even AMS or optically stimulated luminescence, they are not going to help us, because even a date of plus or minus 15, which is a very good resolution in archaeological terms, it gives us 30 years. So that is one of the difficulties that we have. How do we reconcile trying to interpret the archaeological record, which is an aggregate of events of different duration, and real life events where things are happening very fast and often are of a short term? But well, that's a very interesting challenge. Some are coming up with Bayesian models to try and improve on both accuracy and precision. So perhaps the outlook is good. That's so much for Khami. And what I'm going to be doing from now to perhaps for the next 15-20 minutes is to try and bring together everything that we have covered since Monday. Asking questions, providing, trying to provoke you, and then also giving you some conclusions in terms of my own thinking. And my hope, I may fail, but my hope is that when we all leave this room, the ideas that we will have are completely different from what we had when we entered this room in the first place. So these are just what can we say about state formation. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that we have so many places within the region, And some of them, they tend to be associated with the same cultural behaviors, same economic activities, and so on. The ecological zones might be different, but nevertheless, what these people are doing is pretty much the same. So if all these places have got chronologically overlapping layers and so on, how do we determine which one was dominant of all these ones? Do we argue on the basis of size? But the other time we saw that Mapungubwe is not as big as perhaps some of these other places like Mupanipani or Domboshawa and so on. Does that mean that if a place is small, then it's insignificant? Well, let's see. One of the things that I deliberately did was to avoid talking about, what caused the state formation in Southern Africa. Because I simply went to say, well, this is the leopardoscopy and this is Mapungubwe, but what are the causes? What stimulated state formation in Southern Africa? And I will use this as an anchor to then explain why I believe that perhaps in Southern Africa we are looking at a situation where we have multiple centers where state formation are developed and those people were interacting with each other. So in summary, one of the major causes are put forward to account for why Mapungubwe emerged, why Great Zimbabwe emerged, why Khami emerged, and why other places emerged, is that of long-distance trade, particularly that involving the Indian Ocean. The thinking is that long-distance trade brought in new forms of wealth, such as glass beads, cloth, which were then monopolized by the elites and then used as a springboard to political power, patronage. You know, if you do like as I please, I will give you glass beads. You know, if you do as I please, I will give you cloth. And then these guys then became leaders. They became kings, and they also amassed a significant amount of wealth in that process. So the assumption then is that places such as Mapungubwe, places such as Great Zimbabwe, they were redistribution centers, and they monopolized trade with the Indian Ocean. And there are so many adherents to this framework. If you go to Mapungubwe Schroeder, that is one of the theories that come out quite strongly, that long-distance trade played an important role. But we should also not forget that perhaps there were also local factors, such as cattle raising. Somebody yesterday mentioned Peter Galek and his belief that actually cattle is a bankable, it's a reproducible form of wealth, which you can easily convert into a system of patronage when compared to long-distance trade. Because how can you control long-distance trade when you don't have control over when the next ship is going to anchor the Swahili city-states in East Africa? So how can you, that's actually a very risky political strategy to say that, my power is based on proceeds from long-distance trade and you don't control that supply. What happens if the next ship don't come? Then you lose power. Then there's also ideology. Ideology as in, ways of thinking, ways of doing things. And one element of ideology that is frequently cited is, the belief in ancestors as well as life after death. And linked to ancestors is that of land control. So an ideology of land control that is linked to, royal ancestors providing control over, productivity of the land and so on. It is also, I think we have Beach and others who believe in this. Then religion, particularly ruin making. is one of the factors that is also thrown into this mix. The reasoning is the same, that there are one or two people who developed the capacity to make it rain, and then they built political and economic power around that. Then there's also force and coercion, that, those great men, great women stories, like Shaka Zulu. You have a man that become a military genius and then subdues everybody else. So these are some of the reasons. And all of them, they have strengths. They also have weaknesses, but you can also apply them to literally each and every polity, like what is done. However, there is this book which was written by James C. Scott in 2009, and it's called The Art of Not Being Governed. It's quite it's written in Asia, that area between China and Mongolia, and he's talking about a certain a group of people that one might call the barbarians. And he is arguing that in anthropology and archaeology, we tend to think that state formation is, the thing. In terms of progress, we are only progressing if we are a state. But what James Scott is saying is that, well, there are some groups that made a conscious decision to be stateless because they saw that there are so many disadvantages associated with being a state. And what he's saying is that there are so many polities in China that were trying to subdue those barbarians that occupied an area that he calls Zomia. So there are also some areas in Southern Africa that perhaps may not have had any states. So we should also not assume that, everyone wants to be in a state and everywhere we go there were states. Maybe there were also some people that made a conscious decision to be stateless, as it were. So as a way of going towards the end, when do we first see the intensification of connections between Southern Africa and the Indian Ocean? From AD 800 onwards, we see that many communities in Southern Africa, they have evidence of glass beads and so on. So one of the things that is not always emphasized in our frameworks is that what we call Zizo beads, somebody asked me about Skroda the other day. The Zizo beads from Skroda, they have also been found as far as Chobe. They've also been found near Lusaka in Zambia. They've been found in Mozambique, in Botswana. They've also been found in KwaZulu-Natal, at places like KwaGandaganda, so in that Tugela Basin area. And they've also been found in the Shasha-Limpopo. The moral of the story then is that around 800 AD, we have a subcontinent that is being networked with the Indian Ocean, right? So, is this possible that Skroda controlled the distribution of these glass beads from Chobe to Kalundu in Zambia to KwaZulu-Natal? Is that possible? What were the mechanisms for that? What transportation system are we talking about? How many days can you walk from the Shasha-Limpopo to KZN? And so on. So all I am saying is that perhaps if we give agency to communities that were living in different areas, and also perhaps accept that they related with each other, and they also perhaps directly or indirectly participated with the Indian Ocean trading system with different results, then this critical 200 years from AD 800 to 1000, we can see that there are communities that perhaps, for lack of a better phrase, that are on the verge of a takeoff, such that when state formation starts after AD 1000, then everyone is ready. Which is why then one might say that perhaps we are looking at multiple points on the landscape that are associated with state formation. So just to summarize, what is the evidence of interconnections between, Southern Africa and the Indian Ocean? So we have glass beads for that duration, bronze. We also have brass. So brass is a complete import, no zinc, which was exploited pre-colonially in Southern Africa. Then textiles, ivory, gold, and so on. So, and this is just a schematic representation in showing us, the trade routes, the inbound as well as the outbound. So that is, some of the commodities. Then there are also other intangible things such as ideas and so on, which would also have been part of the same package. But how can we identify ideas? Maybe imitations, co-presence of, technologies, and so on. So from about AD 800, we first of all see the earliest appearance of gold working, which, as I explained earlier on, was also associated with many communities and was exchanged with glass beads and so on. So the people who were in the gold producing regions, they are trading and exchanging, and we have that evidence. So these are just ethnographic examples of these quills where gold dust was stored. The other day I mentioned that the Portuguese made replicas of conch shells. These are the original ones, and then so that's why that one had rings and that glaze looked like white. This is the exterior. So we also find a lot of these shells in the archaeological sites in Southern Africa, and they appear from AD 700. There is an archaeological site known as Kadzi in northern Zimbabwe associated with that. From AD 800 onwards, we find from leopard scopy sites that cover a very big area of Southern Africa. That again, what we see in the period AD 800 to 1000, or the 2 centuries preceding, AD 1000. What we see is again that there are multiple places that are associated with different types of activities. So Mapela, as we saw the other time, and we also have Mapungubwe, which of course is associated with the honor of being Southern Africa's first state. But is it, given what we have seen? So these are some of the imported materials, glass beads from Mapela, as well as a possible Islamic bead from Great Zimbabwe. That's the fruitware that I showed the other day. This is coming from the Islamic world, showing that after AD 1000, there is an intensification of contact with the Indian Ocean world. Then there are these ceramics that no one has managed to identify them yet, but there are possibilities that they are associated with the Tang dynasty in China. SAM 699, that's South African Museum accession number 699. So these are some of the objects that were sold by Richard Hall and Co. to Cecil John Rhodes. The same applies to this. So these are some of the fragments of imported ceramics are found at these sites. Again, more of the same. I'm just giving you examples that illustrate basically the same concept, but had not had a chance to show them. I mentioned that Anangombe has a layer that is earlier than Khami, and this apple green ceramic is the same as these ones from Great Zimbabwe. So the idea is that these are places that perhaps were occupied at the same time, or had or were important. And then there's also this blue on white from Great Zimbabwe, the valley enclosures. And so the people that study Chinese ceramics, they can identify what animal is it a cat? Is it, those kinds of things. So when it's complete vessels, you can actually see the full figures and so on. Mapungubwe, Celadon, again, 1, 2, 3, perhaps 1, 2, 3, 4 fragments. What is their significance? Where are the others? Was it a complete thing, or was it just a fragment that was brought by somebody as a curiosity? I am not so sure, but these are questions that some people ask. Then one of the most important finds from Great Zimbabwe is this coin with Arabic inscription. And according to the excavator Huffman, the inscription says Al-Hassan bin Suleiman, who ruled Kilwa between 1320 and 1333. So this is just a single coin. Did Great Zimbabwe have a coinage based on one coin? Most unlikely. So this perhaps was a lucky charm or something like that, which a trader brought and so on. So that's the only one of its kind that is known. And then I mentioned bronze. These are some of the examples associated with that. You also find some of these medallions from archaeological sites suggesting that even finished objects were coming in. Spectacular objects from Mapungubwe. Metal was not just exported, but the people also used it for themselves. So, back to where we started. What was Southern Africa's first state? Is it Mapungubwe? Is it Great Zimbabwe? And if we have multiple places associated with the leopard's copy and associated with Gumanye, can we even have the confidence and the audacity to say that Great Zimbabwe is the first state? Can we also say that Mapungubwe is the first state when we have seen that on the landscape there are other places that also have similar features and so on? What can we say about the relationship between material culture and ethnicity? Is there a correlation? So what happens if different groups, that are within contact decide to copy each other? Does that make them the same group? Because the designs on their material culture is the same. Very often in anthropology or archaeology, we make that mistake. And where does imitation come in? Where you just copy and do things like what the other group is doing. So those are some of the challenges that just because the people at Mapela are behaving exactly the same as the ones at Mapungubwe on the basis of material evidence, at least does that mean that they are the same group of people? The other issue that we need to consider then is that we may perhaps need to invest more work in technology transfer. I didn't emphasize on this for a reason, but there was an interchange of values and interchange of ideas between the East African coast and the Southern African interior. Perhaps we need to identify more of those ideas that have got a point of intersection to learn more. How did different worlds borrow from each other? That's work that is ongoing and continuing. So I believe, and I sincerely believe, on the basis of what I have said, that perhaps, given that more work was performed since 1982. I won't tell you how old I was then. But since 1982, when Huffman first of all floated the idea that Mapungubwe was the first state, which gave birth to Great Zimbabwe, which in turn gave birth to Khami. Now that more work has been done, perhaps it is time to also revisit that linear framework and to start considering the spaces in between and the possibility that agency should not be only associated with one place, regardless of the fact that I'm the only person excavating there. Perhaps we need to start interpreting this idea of multiple centers. There are so many benefits. One of them would be tourism. So that Tuli Circle in Botswana and so on, that landscape of Bosuzwe and so on. What will happen if we also associate it with early states and so on? I'm not so sure, but I hope that from now on, maybe we will start thinking about different states in Southern Africa. My last point is that even if we consider the historical record, there is no point in which there was a single state in Southern Africa. Zulu state, you know, there was the Swazi, there was the other groups associated with that. They were Venda and so on. So even if during the time of the Portuguese there were also many states, so why should we assume that in the past, in the beginning, there was only one state? With that, I thank you so much for coming to this session, and I learned so much from you, and long may it continue. Can we have some questions? Yes, ma'am. The Swahili, the Arabs, they did. They are referred in early texts as the Moors, M-O-O-R-S. But the model which they had was that they would come and go. Yes, or slightly further down. So remember, if you are in Kilwa, that's just a few kilometers from the northern border between Tanzania and the Swahili culture does extend to northern Mozambique. So that Niassa province and so on, you also have the Swahili. So the thinking is that they would have moved into the interior, but their model was you come and go back. The Portuguese introduced this model of say you come and then you settle there. So because the Swahili or the Moors as they are referred to, they left the coast, moved into the interior, and then back to the coast. We don't have evidence for them. Unlike the Portuguese who have these fixed trading centers such as and burials as well, such as Dambarare. One of the projects I'm doing at the moment is looking at the dental calculus from some of the skeletons associated with the Portuguese, to see to what extent they adopt local diet and so on. The results are quite interesting. Some of them are pretty much local. Yes, sir. I think it is human to revolt. So those are some of the considerations that we have to factor in when coming up with those models. So to what extent can you realistically have a situation like that when you are in power? That also goes back to the issue of population. That's why we are now saying no. Perhaps the populations were quite small, smaller than we have traditionally assumed, and then perhaps those commoners could be part of family and so on. And in that case, you won't have that risk of of a revolt and stuff like that. Or if you have a revolt, then you have strategies to mitigate that. But you couldn't. It's either you had very, very, very docile, people to live in that. How else do you come down? So if we remove the steps from that links you to the top of the hill, how are you going to get up? So it's just that, it's that power of criticism, of evaluation, engaging critically with ideas. I think that's what I'm advocating for. That we should not just take things for granted just because Shadrach said it. And the most interesting thing is that here is how archaeological stories start. When I write an idea first, I say probably. The next one, maybe I would say possibly. Then when I write the third paper, I can now write it with certainty that I will say, yes, the king was right here. How do you know? In the beginning, I said possibly or probably. So we also have to understand the development of ideas in scholarship. Yes. Prestige, if it is defense, then why build a house that anyone can see from a distance? How are you going to? Doesn't that become counterintuitive? That I'm saying I'm defending myself, but hey, look at me. There was another hand, okay, there, and then we come down. The ones from no, not yet. No. Which is quite sad actually. But because the other thing is that our museums, our institutions, they are underfunded. So the security protocols themselves, they were not that. I don't even think that they had photographs, because so with Interpol, for example, how do you prove that is yours? So that's a very sad and a very sorry state. So one hopes that perhaps what will happen is that Sandparks will use that as a wake-up call to do better. So there have been calls for the University of Pretoria to return the golden rhino and other objects to Mapungubwe. But can you do that when you can't even secure, Yeah, so that is one of the major challenges, security and so on. But also, why would we steal cultural objects? I don't know. Yes, sir. Proceed.
Something happened that changed that society from a royalty-led society and royalty on hill. What brought about those changes? The next thing is that it appears that, from what I understand, is that it's only at Mapungubwe that they ever unearthed remains of royalty in any of these sites. And I think you said that at Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, they haven't unearthed any human remains. Then going on from the human remains that have been unearthed at K2 and at Mapungubwe and in the rest of the Zimbabwe, have any DNA
I will try to be very brief and hopefully informative at the same time. So we have heard of, was Shaka Zulu a royal? Shaka Zulu, was he a royal? Was he a royal?